Hi everyone, we are so glad to have you guys here for our housing and homelessness panel. Just to start, thank you all for coming out here on a Saturday morning, and we're very grateful for your time and hope that you enjoyed the opening plenary session. We hope that this conference not only sheds light on important issues on poverty and inequality in the United States today, but also provides actionable steps that we can all take to help overcome some of these challenges. We also hope to create a space where we can foster collective action and collective power, and that you guys can take the time and opportunity to get to know each other, and so to take notice of people in the room, to reach out to each other during the reception. And then with that said, also please make sure that your phones are silenced during the session. So I will take a moment to introduce our wonderful moderator, Andrea Reimer. So in spite of her abbreviated formal education, Andrea Reimer has run advocacy organizations and businesses, organized in communities, and served as an elected official, pursuing her passions for environmental justice and supporting empowerment of Indigenous and marginalized communities. She has served 4 terms in local government in Vancouver, Canada, and is currently a Loeb Fellow at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. We feel very privileged to have her serving as our moderator today. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to stand up for a few minutes because I'm going to be sitting down for a while. So as you heard, I'm from Canada. Everyone else on this panel is from the States, and I was thinking as I was walking here how funny it is, if you're North American, you probably get the inherent humor in a Canadian moderating 3 Americans on a panel. So I'm doing this fellowship at the Graduate School of Design called the Loeb Fellowship. I could talk for quite a while about that. I won't. Other than to say that when people ask me what I'm learning there, I feel like the main thing I've been learning is American, which has been hopefully helpful in moderating this panel today. But I did want to start by teaching you a little bit of Canadian, which is that we would not start a meeting like this, particularly at a university, without acknowledging the territory of the Indigenous community on whose traditional territory we stand. So I did want to acknowledge the Massachusetts Wampanoag people and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. So as you heard, I served as a city councillor for 4 terms in Vancouver. The good news about Vancouver is it completely missed the Great Recession of 2008. The bad news is that it meant that we were the first in on the housing crisis, because we didn't have that sort of, I was going to call it artificial, I guess that's a very Vancouver perspective, but we didn't go through what the rest of the continent went to. So as a result of that, we were grappling first with this issue that we're going to be talking about today. And we were able to be first in many areas. We were the first community to bring in an empty homes tax in the world. So we tax homes that are not occupied by the owner or a renter. We were the first in Canada to regulate Airbnb. We were the first to have a renters advisory committee on the planet advising the work that we do at City Council. But my personal experience in housing actually comes not from being elected, but from personal experience. So I'm going to get into that, but before I do, I wanted to get a sense of your personal experience when it comes to housing. So we're going to use this handy technology from Poll Everywhere. I'm guessing many of you have phones and hopefully access to either the cell network or internet. So you'll see up there, it says pollev.com/ and then CPI2019. If you go to that address, you should see the word homeowner. And what I would like to know is that when you see the word homeowner, what does it make you think? I love the word Ghana is up there. It's awesome. So the panelists, if you want to have a look. Okay, let me give it a couple more seconds. Okay, so wealth, privilege, class. stability, words that figure pretty prominently. Okay, we're going to move to the next word that I'd like to get your responses on. Okay, when I say the word evicted, what does it make you think? Interesting juxtaposition, eh? That the biggest word in the last one was wealth, and the biggest word in this one is poor. Okay, last word. When I say the word homeless, what comes to mind? Okay, so bonus questions that won't be on the poll, just show of hands. How many of you have been in the same room at some time with someone who's been evicted? Okay, and how many of you have been in the same room with someone who's been homeless? Okay, that's good, it's helpful. So thank you for sharing that. Part of that's just to help us understand where you're at with the issues, and hopefully through the talk today we can help move some attitudes on it. So my turn. I am a foster kid. I'm Indigenous, foster kid, adopted into the system. These are very common stories where I'm from in Canada, and I think also here in Massachusetts. I left home quite young at 13, lived on the streets. I lived in co-ops, apartments, co-housing, encampments, squats, back alleys, shelters, what we would call SROs. Does that translate into American? Okay. Apartments, and I have rented when I have had stable housing my entire life. My first rental was quite a while back, and it was in the very last 2 years of rental control in the province or state that I lived in, which disappeared pretty quickly. Since then, well, yeah, I didn't start counting evictions at the beginning, but in the last 20 years I've been evicted 11 times. So when I say that, and consider that I was elected for 16 years of those 20 years, so when I say I was evicted 11 times, it never fails to surprise people in Vancouver. And when I say people, though, I don't mean like the average person. I mean the city councilors, the state legislators, the media find this fact incredibly amazing. But think about all those people are people who have much higher incomes than the average renter, and they don't experience that level of eviction. The 58% of people who rent in Vancouver, this is not a surprising story for them. The very first city council all candidates meeting that I was at, I asked people in the room, how many of you have been evicted in the last 2 years? Every single hand in the room went up. Since then, and this was not, it wasn't a forum on housing, it was just a forum. In a bar, so maybe that skewed it a little bit, but it was not, it actually kind of took my breath away to realize that a problem that I understood to be pervasive was actually ubiquitous. So we subsequently did peer-reviewed research and found out that this is the story of most renters in Vancouver. So you'd think that that would be the single biggest problem we faced as a city, but it actually wasn't. The biggest problem was what I would refer to as exceptionalism. And this is this attitude that manifests in two ways. One is that if you're evicted and at some point subsequently homeless, that somehow you are exceptional, that you're exceptionally bad, make exceptionally bad choices, or that, I guess if you're really charitable, you're just exceptionally unlucky, which, as you heard from the stats, is not true. You're just average. The second was that Vancouver was an exceptional city. and that somehow our city council, mine, but also previous ones, had made exceptionally bad decisions about housing, and that this problem was a Vancouver-specific problem. This would be kind of like saying that climate change would be solvable by the city of Boston. It does not absolve them from a responsibility on it and taking action, but housing is no more a made in Vancouver problem or a made in Boston problem or a made in the Bronx or made in LA problem than climate change is. And as long as that exceptionalism attitude pervaded, there was no way that we were going to be able to take action on it. So we're going to talk a little bit about the US, because I've been talking to you about Vancouver. You're about to get a Canadian's view of 5 very simple truths about poverty and housing in America. Does anyone know what this number represents in relation to poverty and housing in America? No, thank God it's not homeless, but could be, because those are the number of Americans that live in poverty. Any guesses on what this list is? This is a list of all the things on which America performs the worst of all the developed nations on earth. This one's going to be tough to guess, but anyone want to take a try? This is the increase in median rent over the last 50 years, which, you know, divide by 50, that's actually not a ton, right? Any guesses on what this number is? Yeah, this is the average increase in median renter income over the last 50 years. When you divide that by 50, it's a much smaller number. So you'd think then that if so many people are having more and more trouble paying for housing, there would be just a whole whack of affordable housing out there, subsidized, core need, social housing. Any guesses on what this number is? This is the shortfall in affordable housing. This isn't just for low-income houses, this is for very low-income houses. So those are the 5 things that I wanted you to know about housing and poverty in the US before we start the panel. But to help us understand what it looks like on the ground, we're going to have people from the States talk about it. And we're going to start with a hometown expert, Dr. Jim O'Connell. So Dr. Jim O'Connell is a Harvard alumni, graduated from Harvard Medical School in 1982, completed a residency in internal medicine at Massachusetts General Hospital in 1985. He began full-time clinical work with homeless individuals as the founding physician of the Boston Healthcare for the Homeless program, which now serves over 13,000 homeless persons each year in 2 hospital-based clinics and in more than 60 shelters and outreach sites in Boston. With his colleagues, he established the nation's first medical respite program for homeless persons, which now provides acute and subacute, pre- and post-operative, and palliative and end-of-life care. And working with Mass General's Laboratory of Computer Science, he's also designed and implemented the nation's first computerized medical record for a homeless program, which started in 1995. He has served on a number of directorships. He's been well awarded, well reported on, and very well published in medical journals. The next person we're going to hear from is Pete White, who's the founder and co-executive director of the Los Angeles Community Action Network, a grassroots organization working to ensure the human right to housing, health, and security are upheld in Los Angeles. He's been a community organizer in LA communities since 1992 and has educated and organized thousands of low-income people on a multitude of issues and campaigns. A lifetime resident of South Central LA, he is committed to fight for a Los Angeles that does not tolerate racial injustice, promotes an equitable distribution of resources, and includes everyone. And last up, we have Randy Dillard, who made it here from his hotel this morning, miraculously, on the sheep pass that passed for roads in Cambridge. He's a resident of the Bronx, a single father of 5 children. He's been a Community Action for Safe Apartments, or a CASA member, for 6 years now, and a CASA leader for 4 of those. He led the fight in CASA's Justice in the Housing Court campaign and has been intricately involved in the citywide Right to Counsel Coalition since 2014. He also joined his local community board, number 3 in the Bronx, which I think he can tell us a bit more about the community board system, and has been on the board for 3 years now, and is a member of the Bronx Defenders and the National Action Network. So we're going to hear from each of the panelists for about 5 minutes. I asked them to give us an overview of some of the work that they're doing, as well as point to one myth that they would like to see busted when it comes to how we move forward on dealing with homelessness and poverty.
Thank you, Andrea, and good morning, everyone. I've been looking around to see how many people have gray hair here, and realize that I'm in the minority. Although one of my classmates from the 60s at Notre Dame is sitting in the back, also has gray hair. So Pat, thank you for being here. You know, I would love to just, in the 5 minutes that I have, just give start by saying one, is that I've been I'm a doctor, so I'm sort of been accidentally into homelessness, so I don't have a history that you would have thought. I grew up in a pretty white town in a lower middle class family and had all the privileges that you could imagine, and got to go to college and then went to medical school, and then ended up being assigned to do the job that I currently do now back in 1985, and it was my introduction to poverty and homelessness. And I could go on about what a rude awakening that was for me, but it's been my life now for the past 35 years. First thing I would say that our program, which has sort of grown in response to trying to figure out how to take care of people's health needs while they're homeless, many of whom have been homeless now for the whole 35 years I've been there, our program had to learn from the people we serve. In fact, on our board of directors, we've now grown to be like a $60 million a year program, but on our board of directors we have about a third of the folks are the people we serve, and so they hire and fire us. And so if I talk about the model that we have, it all came from homeless people themselves. And I'll give you an example of what blew me away, is that I was planning on doing this for a year. My chief of medicine asked me to do it. I was going to become an oncologist, but I thought this would be my year in 1985 of giving back, of doing good, and doing what I guess was solving my late 60s social conscience, which was still raging a bit. But when I got there, I realized that the homeless folks who had put our program together hated people like me. And they had said, with a hail and door document, a legal document they did with the mayor of Boston who was receiving this grant, that if they were going to go along with this program, they demanded a few things. And the first was, this is 1984, that it had to be a program based on social justice and not on charity, which kind of caught me off guard because I had never thought through any of that. And I had, while I was starting to take this job, got every friend I knew to be a volunteer and help out. All my friends in dermatology and cardiology, and we had it knocked. We were going to just figure out how to take care of this. But the homeless folks said, not in your life. We don't want volunteers, because volunteers smack of charity. And I'm thinking, volunteerism is what I live by, the most important thing. They didn't want that. So I had to come to grips with serving a community that was looking for continuity of care, and not a bunch of people who come and spend a week or 2 weeks and do their good work and then move on, as I was doing, or planning on doing. So one of the issues that I think always haunts us when you get into this problem is how do you set up systems that provide that continuity of care, which I think is at the core of quality and value. And I can give you many examples of that over time as our homeless folks on our program sort of demand. But what we did have to do was figure out how, at their demand, we had to stay part of the hospital. So unusually, I'm still part of Mass General Hospital and Boston Medical Center. That was a demand by the people we were serving, because when they got sick, they wanted to be sure there was a doctor, their doctor could still take care of them when they were in the hospital. And they saw hospitals as very frightening, awful places for them. And then what we had to do was not do our clinics so much in the hospital, but go to wherever homeless people were. So we had to set up a whole network of getting doctors and nurses and everybody into the shelters. So we do clinics in about 45 shelters around town, which has turned out to be like a miracle for us, because these clinics happen after people have already gotten into the shelter. They have their bed, they can get a meal, and then they can see their healthcare providers. And we've learned a long time ago that we are way down the list of priorities when you're out in the streets trying to survive. So we had to insert ourselves at the right point in time for them. We also spend a lot of time serving those people who stay on the streets, won't even come into the shelter. And in Boston, we have a really, there's been a tradition for years, hundreds of years actually, of having shelter beds for people who are homeless. All the shelters in Boston, except for one, let you come in if you're drinking or not, so there's no sobriety requirement. And while many of them were once faith-based, none are faith-based now, or very few are faith-based now, so there's no requirement for any of that as well. But there's still a bunch of people who, even though there's a bed guaranteed for them or a mat, will still stay outside. And my particular clinical practice has been trying to figure out how to serve that group, who turns out to, as you can imagine, bear the highest burden of co-occurring medical and psychiatric and substance use disorders. And they turn out to also be the people that we see most frequently in our healthcare systems at great cost. And one of my favorite pictures, which I should have showed to you, is that, you know, there's a picture that a homeless woman took, whose name is Keisha, now on our board of directors, of 15 of her friends sitting in a little park at Mass General Hospital back in the year 2000. Back in a time when in Massachusetts, for those of you not from here, everybody who was homeless basically had insurance. We had Mass Health because of Romney Care starting in 1996. And they were sitting on the grounds of a hospital, and she showed me this picture which she took in 2000. She gave it to me when she went to a surgery in 2005, and I'm looking at this picture of all these folks I know whose average age was about 36, and there was just one alive 5 years later. So as we've now learned, homeless folks, if you really look carefully, bear a huge burden of premature mortality that looks much more like a third world than it does like a first world, despite the fact they're in the shadows of our great healthcare institutions. So I could go on about that, about different things, but I know I've got no time left, and I've been debating about what to say about a myth. So I'm gonna divide it in two. I think there's one myth that we've had to learn, we've got to stop living by, and that's that we often think that we believe, and we'll try to believe, all men are created equal, all men and women are created equal, but that does not mean all men and women have equal opportunity. And I think sometimes in our country we forget that. So I think, please, we need to get rid of that myth. The other myth, which is much more provocative for me, and it's come from 35 years of trying to look this through, is we used to say that housing is health, and I think that's a myth. I think we're escaping what are some of the really significant social determinants of health if we think of taking a homeless person, putting him in a house is the end of the story. So there's a lot of provocative stuff that I would love to talk about that.
So good morning, everyone. How are you guys doing, first and foremost? Sounds like about 3 people are in the room. How's everyone doing this morning? A lot better, a lot better. You know, I'm going to try to be as disciplined with my comments as possible this morning, but as is usually the case, following both of y'all, so many different ideas and things to respond to came up for me. So a couple things. I just want to start by talking a little bit about the Los Angeles Community Action Network and sort of why we've started and sort of our theory of social change, right? So I'm going to take you back to 1992. I was looking for my cousin Herman, who was battling with substance abuse. And battling with substance abuse and an addiction to crack cocaine in 1992 is very different, and the response to that is very different to the opioid crisis that we see today, right? Opioid crisis is a public health issue today, but the crack cocaine epidemic was for sure a reason that we built prisons and penitentiaries and jails across the country. And so that search for my cousin led to downtown Los Angeles, Skid Row, right? And when you think about Los Angeles is an organizing town. It's a union town. People think about it as a very progressive place, Tinseltown, right? But when you talked about houselessness, 2 things happened immediately. The very first thing that happened is that it was seen as an issue of charity and choice, right? And it was also seen as an issue of personal failings, right? It was an issue of meritocracy. You just didn't try hard enough if you couldn't, come up in Los Angeles. That's one side, right? But then on the progressive side, right, the progressive community did not feel that houseless people, poor people, had agency, right? Had agency to deliver and build the power necessary to sort of uproot systems of oppression that continue to feed, even today, a growing and swelling houseless population. So our early work, right, was to write that lie, write that myth. For it took us 20 years in the city of Los Angeles organizing to actually make houselessness a housing issue. I'm going to say that again. It took 20 years to make We don't use the word homeless, right? Because we see our communities as our homes, particularly in Los Angeles. And this is actually a trend across the country. We're oftentimes led to believe that houseless people come from somewhere else, right? Houseless folks from New York come to Los Angeles because it's so much better, it's so much warmer to be in Los Angeles and houseless than in New York, right? Which is a lie, actually. 80% of those who are houseless come from the communities in which they're houseless in, right? And that is definitely exacerbated when you're looking at center cities changing and gentrification happening, right? And so for us in Los Angeles, policy was driven by this idea and this myth that people came from somewhere else and that it was their choice to land on the street in the cardboard where they found themselves. And so for us, it was important, A, to undo that myth, and B, make sure people understood that houselessness was actually an economic justice issue. It was a gender justice issue. It was a racial justice issue, right? It was a housing justice issue. But then we would go even further than that, right? We would begin to create bodies of work that really mapped Black homelessness. Because in our organizing, first in our organizing, and then in our research, we found that race was strikingly missing, right, from most of the works on houselessness across the country, right? People weren't talking about race, right? And so we thought it was important to talk about race, particularly in Los Angeles, because by and large, if you come to Los Angeles, you'll see Black houseless people till your eye goes dim. Like, it's the predominant face of individuals, right? And so for us as a community organization, we're like, yo, wait a second. It can't be a choice when, you know, the predominant number of houseless people happen to be Black, so let's map and figure out what's happened, right? And so this is what our mapping, and this is what the stories sort of unearthed, right? First, deindustrialization in South Central Los Angeles hit the Black community like a ton of bricks, right? In Los Angeles, just so folks know, the war economy was huge. And so Black folks worked in the steel industries, right? They worked in aerospace. They worked in the rubber plants, right? When all of those industries left, homelessness started to rise, right? And another interesting thing happened after the industries left. The crack cocaine epidemic blossomed, right? And with the blossoming of the crack cocaine epidemic, Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton would famously quit super predators. And that super predator comment was more than rhetoric. It was more than a comment. It led to the omnibus crime bill, which then led to the full-scale militarization of our communities, which then led to the widespread building of prisons across California, which then led to those black jobless people being pushed into prisons. And if that wasn't enough, then we would get welfare reform, which we would call on the ground welfare deform, right? Which would then plummet, it would snatch an already miserable safety net from folks and lead Black women. The feminization of poverty would increase. And then we would go to NAFTA, and then we could go on and on and on. I say this, and I tell you this story because we thought it was important to move away from policymaking, right? That was really rooted in this idea that it was personal choice. We thought it was important to show that it was in fact political decisions that have led to sort of what we consider the banishment of an entire community. So we began to organize on 3 core principles, and then I think I'm gonna try to be done, because I see 1 minute over there, and I was like, ain't no way. We're gonna do all of this shit in 1 minute, but we're gonna do what we can do. We're gonna do what we can do, Andrea. So this is what we're gonna do. So it sort of led to sort of our theory of change, right? Which is rooted in 3 core principles. Excuse me, jet lag. Community organizing, or the power building aspect of the work, right? The ability to build organization that embodies the will and spirit of its constituents, right? How do we do that? Leadership development, policy work, cultural work, right? You name it, whatever it takes to build the energy and the power to move the systems. Point 2, and all of these are part of sort of our power building analysis, is direct services. But not the direct services that you think about, like soup kitchens and things of that nature. The one direct service that we actually provide are legal services. We've operated a legal clinic for the last 15 years because what we found was one of the largest barriers to participation in the power building aspect was the criminalization of our communities, right? And then the third and the last, and then I'm going to pass it, was community improvement, right? We thought, and so part of our community improvement initiative in poor communities across the country, food insecurity is a huge issue, right? Skid Row, for folks who don't know, is actually located in the produce hub of the West Coast. And so most fresh produce that goes across the West Coast comes through our community. However, the 15,000 folks that live there don't have access to fresh fruits and vegetables, right? We have corner stores, so we can get things high in salt, high in sodium, things that are gonna not help our diabetes, not help our health conditions, right? And so we created a food program where we have a network of gardens that we operate, so we can sell food back to folks who actually have resources to subsidize the ability to folks in our communities to get healthy. And we believe that putting those three components together has really led to our ability to build power in Los Angeles, and I will talk about more stuff at some point, I promise.
Hello everyone, it's good to be here in Boston. This is a hard act to follow. You understand, I think I'm one of the different panelists than anybody here. I'm here because I was almost evicted. And I got with an organization called Council Community Action for Safe Apartments. And what we do is protect affordable housing in New York City. What was strange this morning was when I was eating breakfast, I never seen someone bringing their dog and feed their dog while you in a hotel eating breakfast. So that was new to me. Wasn't nothing wrong with it, but it was new to me. But anyway, where I live at in New York, I live in the Bronx, and we had an eviction rate of 11,000. So with our organization, we formed a committee for the campaign to reform housing court. So what we did, we partnered up with Urban Justice and we went into housing court. And what we found out that tenants did not know about stipulations, they didn't know nothing about adjournments. 90% of the landlords' lawyers, they had lawyers, tenants didn't. So we put out a report called Tipping the Scales. And then we partnered with Andy Sherman out of New York Law School, and we formed a coalition. We got 2 councilmen to sponsor the bill, Mark Levine and Vanessa Gibson. So we took city councilmen and the public advocate and the controller, we took them on tours through housing court. I don't know if any of y'all are aware of Matt Desmond, who wrote the book Evicted. And we took him on a tour through housing court. Then what we did, we had a forum at New York Law School, one of the worst snow and winter days there was. We had a forum, but we drew 450 people at that forum that day. And it was made up of tenants, judges, and commissioners of HPD. We spoke to the media. The next thing we did, we went to every city councilman, and we got them to sign on, which is 41 city councilmen. We went to all of the community boards, and we pushed a presentation, and we got them to sign on. We collected 7,000 signatures, and we took them and we dropped them at the mayor's office and the speaker's office. We had a hearing, which we had so many people at that hearing that they couldn't let everybody in. We had 78 people testify. So the mayor found out that he could not veto that bill, so he came up to the Bronx, and in 2017, he signed that bill into law. New York was the first in the country to have, we call it the right to counsel, but they call it universal access. And what it's doing now is that these landlords now don't dominate housing court anymore. They just can't just bring you to court for no apparent reason and just push you out and push you out and push you into the shelters. It's bad enough being a single parent with 5 kids. But what's really frightening is that you're going to wind up in court for not owning the landlord because he refused to do repairs in your apartment. You know, doing this work and being involved in this work, you ought to see the conditions that we go into these apartments and see how people are living. And then some of these people that we see how we living, they wind us up in shelters. And there is no cause for that. That's why we fought as hard as we fought to get this bill passed. Now they done passed it in San Diego. They done passed it in Newark. Philly is thinking about passing it. Chicago is thinking of passing it. And I do think Boston is thinking about passing the bill for the right to counsel.
All right, that was an impressive summary of a huge amount of work. So I had, we're going to have a bit of a discussion, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So if you've got questions on your mind, maybe jot them down, and we'll open it up in about 15 minutes. So Jim, you told us about the myths you'd like to see busted. And Pete, I don't know that you meant it exactly as a myth you wanted to see busted, but I really loved your framing of houseless folks, that home is not a building, it's a community for people. I think that's a good myth to bust. Randy, did you have a myth that you'd like to see busted? Can I get you just to pass them on? Thank you.
You know, they say affordable housing. To me, that's a myth. It's affordable for who? You understand? You got people working 2 and 3 jobs. You understand? They still can't pay their rent. So how is it affordable? So to me, that's a myth.
So something that struck me, there were 2 things that all 3 of you spoke to in different ways, and I wanted to maybe tease some of that out a bit more. You all spoke, I mean, let's just sort of put aside the people who believe you're homeless because you made a choice to be, it's not my worldview, so I can't really give it the right words, but you know the folks I'm talking about. But you all spoke about what we would call progressives in Canada who are on board for action, but the way that they're on board crowds out the very people that they're there, they think that are motivating them to be there. So I would think of it as them doing things to and for people instead of doing things with people. And you all spoke about the need to change that organizing model. So can you speak a bit about that? What, if you could inspire all the folks in this room to show up in that way, what would you tell them? How do they walk into that room? How do they reach out to different communities and show up for those communities?
You know, I think it's interesting. I'm thinking about Bobby Seale right now. When he said the best organizer that we had in the Black Power struggle, I wasn't there, of course, was the state, right? And so when I think about houselessness right now, and particularly when I think about houselessness in Los Angeles voters are motivated right now to do something different because the face of houselessness is changing, right? Is it still a lot of black and brown folks? Of course it is, right? But now the nurse is living in the car. The teacher is living in the car. White folks are living in cars. And that creates a different type of fear and response. We leveraged that fear and response in 2 different propositions that we moved forward in Los Angeles in the last couple of years. The very first was Proposition HHH, which brought $1.2 billion to build permanent supportive housing in the city of Los Angeles, 10,000 units. And then the other was Measure H, which was $3.5 billion, which was set up to provide services for houseless people. What's important about both of those propositions is that Angelenos overwhelmingly came out in support, right? In support of taxing themselves to make sure that these resources were available. I think it's important to note, though, those on the front lines of making sure that those propositions pass were houseless people and poor people who are impacted by the decisions. I think the other thing that becomes important in our organizing, 3 words motivated our organizing, right? We're still here, right? The ability to remain in place. We're still here, right? And so our policy agenda has always been sort of developed to ensure that we are still in community to be able to fight back, right? Because what we know in this country and in Canada as well with indigenous folks is if they remove you from the land, you ain't never, ever going back, right? And so we can talk more about that, but it's really been taking advantage of the political climate in Los Angeles and taking advantage of the contradictions. There's booms all over the skylines, but they're building for the mega rich, while at the same time, the dance of the cranes is on the skyline. Encampments and informal settlements are being erected just as quickly.
The thought thing that I've been obsessing with a little bit is, so for example, like for the first 20 years I was doing this job, taking care of people out on the streets, no one was ever eligible for housing. And then we had these really interesting things in the early 2000s where studies showed that permanent supportive housing was the way we should go, and we should flip the way we align people and let those who are most vulnerable on the streets be top in the line and instead of at the bottom. And the interesting thing for us is our board of directors, we're a homeless program, so as our folks began to get housed, we said, great, now they'll be in the community and we don't have to worry about them. But our homeless folks said, no, listen, if you've been their doctor for 20 years, you can't abandon them just because they got housing. So for the last 15 years, we've been following our folks into housing and trying to take care of them, do a lot of home visits. And that's another eye-opener for me, which has been totally different. And what we've realized is that a couple things in Boston. One is most of the places we can get for people are in the poorest areas with the most blighted neighborhoods. So we're moving them from the inner, from downtown on a street into a studio in an area of town where it's pretty dangerous. And that the needs they have and they will ask you for are huge once they get into housing. And as we've now followed people over time, our inability to support them has meant that if you look at 15 years down the line, most of them are back on the streets. And I don't think we recognize that as a society. We think we get the house and get them in there and then that's the end of the problem. And so we're trying to figure out how do you do just, I went out to LA for a while and was amazed at what the citizens had voted there, the money and the services. And they voted the service component to the housing, and it's going to be really interesting to see how much of a difference that makes. What I do worry a little bit about, well, let me leave it there because there's much more to it, but the people in at least in Boston, the people who end up in the streets have been through hell since they were kids. And what you're trying to do is address the problems that the poor school system, the poor welfare system, the child welfare stuff, all of that, wrecked upon them when they were 8, 9, and 10 years old. And then now that they're homeless and 42, there's a lot that needs to be done, and a lot that they need for community and everything else. So the house is no longer a home for them. The house is kind of a structure. How you make it a home becomes the struggle for us.
We should talk. I was in Vienna, and they have totally reformed. I mean, it's hard to draw parallels with Vienna, which you might have heard of in your travels if you do a lot of work in this area, because they're both a state and a municipal government, so they have all the powers of a state in a city council, which is a dream. Yeah, it's a big wow for those of us that are like, oh, what would I do if I had the taxation and legislative authority of a state? But they do have an incredible health delivery model. They've actually are phasing out all their supportive housing in favor of mobile supports that follow you wherever your housing goes, like to this point of dignity and how it's not the state making a choice about where you live, it's you making a choice, and how much that helps them recover from the trauma that they've experienced, usually for a large part of their life.
So let me just hop in really quick. I think the other thing, though, as we talk about permanent supportive housing, we're talking about permanent supportive housing in 10,000 units in Los Angeles. The thing that happens people believe, A, that 10,000 units is enough to deal with our homeless crisis, right? Which on paper, and we know this is an undercount, is like 56,000 people first. But then also, individuals don't realize that permanent supportive housing isn't for every houseless person. It's for the most vulnerable, right? And so in Los Angeles, we're talking about housing for about 10, 15, 20% of those who are houseless. I think what's most important, and this is the part that people have to realize, is that most houseless people, what they really need is a home. So in Los Angeles, we need 550,000 units of housing that's affordable, to your point earlier, affordable to people who are making like 25, 30,000 on down, 550,000 units. And so it's when we disconnect sort of housing and houselessness that we create policy decisions that have blinders on, right? And so if there's anything that's left in the room, we need in Los Angeles 550,000 units to deal with the problem. And even with the 10,000, that still is just a drop in the bucket.
In New York City, our problem with some of the homelessness is that the average income in the boroughs that we live in might be 25 to 30,000. So you have these developers that have come in and they want to rezone an area, and their average income they want to bring in is from 60 and up. Because where I live at in the Bronx now is prime real estate, you understand? And these are the type of people that they want to bring in, so they want to push you out. So they help create the homeless problem in some of these cities with their development. All we ask is when you come in, it's not that we don't care about you coming to rezone our neighborhood, but why do you come in to rezone our neighborhood and push people out and make them homeless when you know we need schools, when you know we need lighting, when you know that we need jobs, bring in apprenticeship programs so where people can take and be able to move up, to be able to afford the rent if you got apprenticeship programs within inside your community. They don't have that no more. When I was going to school, you had auto mechanics, you had, like I was telling the gentleman earlier today, you had electricity, the ladies had nursing, they had typing up. So if you didn't always go to college, you came out of high school with a trade. So now, when you're coming in now and you're coming to the rezoning community, you're going to push us out to people like us. That's what we're fighting for. We're fighting to try to bring programs in and to keep people in our communities. And we will never stop homelessness until you stop these developers from coming into your neighborhood and changing your neighborhood.
So I was going to maybe leave this question for later because I feel like I already put my Canadian cards on the table it's early on. But for those that don't know, in Canada, what we would call a conservative would be sort of at the far left of the Democrat Party here. So contextualize that question as you will, the question I'm about to ask. So your landlord has the right to profit from the housing that you're living in, or those developers have the right to profit off the land. Can that right coexist with your right to housing? Housing that you can afford, housing that's safe, housing that is big enough for you and your family.
Did you say, can that right?
Yeah.
Or does that right?
Can. I can guarantee you it doesn't.
No. So hell no. So definitely it does not. So I think a couple of things. I think the first thing, when I started organizing around housing, the target, oftentimes the landlord, was very clear. Like, you knew who owned the building. You knew who you were paying rent to, right? Now, it's not as clear, right? When we think about the financialization of housing, when we think about housing actually as an asset, actually as stock, when I think about Blackstone, right, who during the mortgage meltdown was an exotic company doing exotic loans, who then now are landlords in Los Angeles, helping to drive sort of gentrification, and who owns most of the property that Black and brown women had to foreclose 10 years ago, right? I think it becomes more complicated, right? We attempted to pass rent control, statewide rent control a few months ago in our state. And it was like Blackstone, and remarkably, it wasn't just the corporations who came out against us, it was also some of the unions, because the unions found out that some of their investments was into housing, right, as an asset. And so the target is very different now than it was at first. Now, for us, are we attempting to organize to stay in our communities? That is exactly what we're doing. And we're very clear, while yes, it's the development community, but the development community was primed by city government, right? By creating different types of tools and policy tools to help rid our communities. When we first started the work, we talked about our housing security work as anti-displacement work, right? Because when you think about displacement, at least with displacement, you're thinking that you're displaced from one place to another place. There's this idea that there's somewhere else to go, right? But now we talk about our work from a frame of anti-banishment, right? Because once you are evicted, or once you are kicked out of your house, there is nowhere else to go, right, but the bricks. And so, can we organize to stay in our communities? Yes, that's what we're doing. But the target has changed so greatly in the last 20 years that we've been doing this work.
Jim, I'd be really interested in your perspectives, because you've seen some changes, I'm sure, over time.
No, and despite all the, I don't want to be a naysayer here or anything like that, because I completely agree. What has struck me though is, if you look at the homelessness or houselessness problem around the country, it's primarily concentrated in urban settings where the value of property is going up like that. So there is, in Boston, for example, where we're pretty landlocked, there's no place anymore where you can go and rent an apartment on a minimum wage. You just can't do it. So that means that the housing crunch is hard to solve for us. I have friends in cities like Salt Lake that they can actually solve the problem because they've got land and they can build housing. But we can't. So San Francisco, LA, Portland, Seattle, Chicago, Boston, New York has a huge problem that is different than, I think, a rural problem. We should accept that. Second thing is, much to my dismay, there is no right to housing in our country. So setting up a right to housing is something that seems to me fundamental, just like a right to health care. And then what that leads me to is I realized that injustice, the structural injustice in our healthcare system, and this is the American, not the Canadian, means that poor and vulnerable people are always going to be left out. It's based on it's a market rate healthcare system, and it needs to be. That's why I think you see so much about Medicare for all now, because it's the only way to make it equal. I have a funny feeling that housing, which is based on a for-profit motive, needs to be the same way healthcare is. That in some way housing has to be provided as a right to everyone, and it can't float to the marketplace. Because if it goes to the marketplace, we're stuck with 7.7 million units that we haven't done. Final thing I'll say on this is I wish I had brought a slide, but if you look at the HUD budget, so HUD is really the federal thing responsible for building housing, housing and urban development. So we had a terrible crisis back in the early 1980s, a financial downfall. And the HUD budget for very low income housing went from $90 billion per year, which it was traditionally going through the 70s and into the early 80s. And under the administration that came in during that time, they brought it down to less than $20 billion. So it was a $70 billion cut in housing. And if you look at in today's dollars, we've never gone back. We still are at that. And every year that's gone by, we've taken $70 billion out of money to build housing for poor people. And then I want to go, we shouldn't be looking to the healthcare system to solve this. This is big money that ought to come from federal stuff. But no one talks about that. We always look to how can Medicaid help, or how can hospitals give some money to housing, or how, and I feel like we're selling ourselves out when we let that be the solution.
Randy, did you want to throw in on this right to housing question?
Basically, y'all done covered everything. what's left out is that the focus need to always be on these landlords, because we find out sometimes it's not about money, it's about power. You understand? And when we're in these rooms, we sometimes forget that we're talking about people that are suffering. I had a chance, you know, to be in D.C. at a conference, and it hurt me to my heart to hear these homeless people speaking. And one gentleman said that it feels good to take a bath. It feels good that somebody over the years reached out to me, and I now have my apartment. He said, do you know what it's like day in, day out that you're thinking and you're not aware of your own funk? And I'm sitting here and I'm listening to this gentleman talk, and everybody in the room was crying just about. He said, you don't know what it's like to have a buggy or your stuff and the police just come and take everything away from you. So we have to remember, all of us, even you, that homeless people have pride. Homeless people is just like me and you. We don't know how that they got to where did they got. And that gentleman, when he spoke in Washington, D.C. and them other gentlemen, they made me realize that. Because I'm on the train sometimes and I see homeless people. You understand, people get up and they'll move away from them and everything. You give them a little change, you know what to do. But we do not realize, from his point of view as medical, that these people are suffering and they need help. You know, so this is with us, and you know, this is a constantly battle for us. Like, I don't do what I'm doing now. This panelist, I'm grassroots. I like to fight and change things. That's what I like to do. I like to go in, start an argument, start a fight. You understand? Because you know, these people need help. You understand? And when I went to court, 5 kids, I wound up in a shelter, and they got to tell me when I can go to bed, when I can come in, and can anybody visit me? What the hell did I do wrong to be in here for you to tell me what to do when I don't owe my landlord no rent? You understand? So you have to watch out for these landlords, and you got to be mindful that the people that we're talking about, these are human beings and they are suffering. And if you ever get a chance, sometimes, like I had the chance to do, it hurt me to my heart to hear somebody say how good it feels to take a bath. Something that we all in this room take for granted. And we have to remember that.
Powerful. Well, it's over to you guys. Colin, I forgot to ask you if there's a mic for the floor, or shall I? I can just pass this one around, or you can. Yep. We'll start here and then we'll go over there.
Great, thank you all for your very thought-provoking comments. One issue that I would like to dive a little into is youth homelessness. There's an organization which was started here in Harvard, and many people here might know about it, Y2Y, which is now expanding around America. And it's a youth-to-youth run homeless shelter just a couple of blocks up the street here. So I'd like to get some of your thoughts on specific issues associated with youth homelessness, but over and above just issues, potential solutions and things that we as a community should be thinking about when dealing with this issue.
Do you want me to take a few questions in the answer? Okay, so there's a woman with a scarf back there. Yeah. Anyone else in that area? Well, okay, so we'll do 1, 2, 3, and then we'll answer that after.
I work in a public school. 500 of 60 students out of 500 are houseless. I have the stories of the students. I see them during the school day. I can imagine them getting up and just coming to school, going through what they are going. I have one story of one family who who lives in a motel, and there are 3 children. The motel is only to sleep. They cannot cook. They eat outside. And but I see him coming to school and playing chess at lunchtime. So I've been I've been dealing with this story for 6 months, and they need $12,000 to pay the property management that they owe to. Their credit is ruined, and they pay $600 to the motel, and they need $5,000 or $6,000 to move into an apartment. So I'm trying to see how can I solve the issue. Should I keep listening their stories? How can I help them?
And are you here in the Boston area, or Cambridge, or?
I'm in Massachusetts,
Okay,
yes.
okay. Colin, I've got 3 down here on the front row, and then we'll get some answers.
Hi there. So my question was related to, Randy, your comment about the myth. You said that affordable housing is essentially a myth because who can actually afford it? So I was wondering if you thought that there was a better term instead of affordable housing, how you would think that we should refer to it.
Thank you guys for the amazing work you do organizing and fighting for power, and really I love the comment that was made earlier, which is that this is about social justice and not charity. The question I had is around sort of legislative focal points. We've talked a lot about the state and sort of the local level with organizing activism that can happen. But I'm just wondering, from your perspectives, are there things that are on the legislative docket federally that we need to be thinking about mobilizing towards? And if not, what ought we be asking for, particularly in light of very important elections coming up?
I agree with Dr. O'Connell, and I'm assuming the rest of the panel does, that housing should absolutely be a right, and it's something that should be decommodified, as healthcare should. But of course, that's something that people have been fighting for, including people on this panel, for a long time, and it's unclear to me how exactly that would be achieved, especially here in the United States. So with that in mind, my question for the entire panel is, it seems to me rent control is one of the best ways of sort of cleaving back against the prices just kind of indefinitely going higher, and that a lot of the anti-rent control rhetoric is baseless, because the argument is it prevents new tenants from moving in. Well, yeah, because it's protecting the existing tenants there. But I wanted to get the panel's opinion on rent control, and specifically from Ms. Reimer. I was wondering, did having a national health care system, even though you were homeless and transient, did having a national health care system improve your experience, since you knew you could still have that guaranteed medical coverage? Thank you.
All right. Randy, do you want to kick off, because you had the question about affordable definition, and anything else you want to?
Yes, I think one thing that we're working on, our organization, when I say affordable for who, is that now these landlords, even though we have passed the right to counsel, they got a thing they call MCIs, Major Capital Improvement, and whatever they do to the building, they pass that cost down onto the tenants, and you're paying your rent and whatever it is that take to do the building. So what we need to do, what we're trying to do, We have in New York, which is called the RGB. We have hearings every year why landlords don't need a rent increase, that they give every year a percentage, and we're fighting against that. We have tenants to come out and testify why they shouldn't get a rent increase. So it should be some more. We're trying to get the city council to pass some kind of rules and regulations down on them to where they just can't keep raising your rent or pushing these MCIs down on you. That's what I mean when I say affordable. You got just it's a constantly battle, constant fight. And for that lady right there, what's her name? You have to, what we did with the right to counsel, you have to go to the media, you have to keep these stories about these people and their conditions, you got to keep it in the front papers and in the newspapers and in the news, so you can shed the light on it to try to change whatever situation that family is if you ain't got no other control to do anything else.
Yeah, this is like the speed round. So I think a couple of things just on housing affordability, just to remind folks, in Los Angeles, 120% of median qualifies for affordable housing. So you could make roughly $80,000, $90,000 a year, and that be considered affordable. And that's important to note. Yes, and so that's important to note because the average rent in Los Angeles right now for a 2-bedroom is $2,800 per month, right? And so annual rent at the $2,800 to $2,900 per month, annual rent payments is somewhere like $30,000, $31,000. Now, when I talked about earlier, we needed 550,000 units of housing for poor folks. Those are for people who are making annually $32,000 a year. So what that means is $32,000 in annual rent payments plus $32,000 that you're making. All of your money is actually going to rent if you're able to find housing. And so for us, when we think about affordable housing, we say housing that's affordable across the spectrum. For people that have very little money, zero money, all the way up to those at 30% of median. Because right now, affordable housing, as it's sort of defined, misses oftentimes, or folks aren't building for those folks who are at the lower medians, right? So a lot of the projects that are built aren't built for folks who are making 30% of the area median. It's built for those who are higher income earners. That's one. The federal fix, going back to Doc earlier, is the HUD budget, right? I don't think we're going to get a federal fix with Ben Carson's, with the Trump administration, but we weren't going to get a fix actually with the Obama administration either, because what we're looking at is, over the last 20, 30 years, is an attempt to privatize the housing, public housing within the federal government. Is it something that we're pushing for? Yeah, we're definitely pushing for it. Like in LA, in Los Angeles, there's a big push since we were able to push a bond measure to get 10,000 units. There's a big push now by the city to sell city-owned buildings and properties to developers, and then use the fees off the sale to put into an affordable housing bucket of money. It's the last thing we want. So for us, we're like, what we need to do for buildings that we can rezone and make habitable, we need to make sure the city of Los Angeles retains ownership. We want the city of Los Angeles to actually be landlords, not selling off the buildings for these in lieu fees. Why that's important, per unit in Los Angeles right now, 1 unit of housing in Los Angeles costs roughly between $550,000 to $700,000 per unit, 1 unit, right? And so we're definitely trying not to fall there. I'm going to pass it.
You're great. So looking at what hasn't been addressed yet, we didn't address Y2Y. And I think one of the emerging problems in our particular world as well is youth homelessness, which is really a perplexing and pressing problem. I've spent a lot of time at Y2Y, and I think it's one of the more extraordinary things that's happened. I salute all of you who have been involved in that, because it's really looking, I apologize for my cold here, at the fundamental issues. What we don't know is what happens to youth over time, and so we really need to learn from you how best we should structure our stuff. I can go on that, and I think in answering the, wow, I'm so sorry. So family homelessness, I've spent a lot of time taking care of families in motels. And the discouraging thing for me is that 20 years later, excuse me, I now take care of some of those kids because they're living on the streets. So the structural part of family homelessness is really frightening and needs to be addressed. But let me frame something here that bothers me, not bothers me, but I'm tantalized by. So my wife just finished her PhD at the School of Public Health here and wants to do homelessness research. And when we looked around, I have a lot of friends who are fabulous at the School of Public Health, but you know there's not a single person at the School of Public Health who has homelessness as their research interest. And I'm going, wait a minute, homelessness is one of the most pressing public health issues facing us all over. And then if you look around, there's no one who can be funded to look at this completely pressing problem. So as I sit here at the Kennedy School, I keep thinking one thing that's lacking when I think of legislative stuff and all that is we don't have a, if I think of homelessness, I want to say the easiest way I look at it, it's a prism you hold up to society. What you get refracted are the weaknesses in all of our sectors. It's not just the housing or the healthcare, it's the education, corrections, you name it, all of that. So where else would it be perfect to study this but in a university setting where you can get the law school, the medical school, the public health school, the policy school, the business school to get together and look at this as a broad problem. But I challenge you to say, where in our country is anybody even looking at it like that? So I feel like we're way down the line in, it's a pressing problem, but no academic or federal interest. If I want to write a grant to study homelessness, I can't look to the CDC or NIH. They don't accept anything like that. You have to go find private funding. So we need to change some of this real structural thing and say, if we really want to know what works, we have to study it the same way we do things in medicine. You study like crazy to find out what works. But there are virtually no studies out on homelessness that have randomized control, all the stuff that you might learn from. And I would end by saying there was a National Institute of Medicines, which is the old, the National Academy of Sciences, the old Institute of Medicine, released a report last July that had looked at the current evidence to show that permanent supportive housing either saves money or improves health. And they did this 3-year look at the world literature, et cetera. Several people from LA were on it, including Mitch Katz. And you know what the answer was? There is zero evidence that shows that permanent supportive housing either saves money or improves health. Now, does that mean it doesn't do that? No. What it means is we haven't invested in looking at it. And we have all these pre and post studies that seem to show cost savings, but we don't do the randomized control trials. There's 4 of them, including one Canadian one, which show no savings. So we have a lot to learn, and very few people have got the resources or the ability to look into that. So I urge you to, as you go back to your own institutions, see who's studying homelessness and how we can get people to do that.
Thank you, Jim, for persevering too through the cold. So sorry to your question, the more personally directed one. So we do have socialized medicine in Canada. It's free, we're not kidding, 100%. All those stories you hear about us having waiting lists. I'm married to an American. My healthcare is so much better than his, and also free. I'm also living here now and getting a first-hand look at it. But what we don't have is dental, free dental. I mean, we do have dental care, but it costs market rates. So after 10, 12, 13 years of hard drug use and sex work and sleeping on concrete, my body was, I'm pretty good. I'm pretty healthy. I have a few chronic illnesses that I will carry with me for the rest of my life, but they're well managed, and I can easily afford, as could any Canadian, to look after myself. My dental, however, I did go to the Harvard Dental Clinic because I had a little dental emergency. The doctor there, the surgery guy, forgetting the name of the exact specialty, peria something something. He asked me if I had been a boxer, because he said your mouth has so much trauma on it that it looks like you've been punched repeatedly for years. And that's just from a lack of, I mean, it's from the food I ate, the just lack of care over a good long period of time. Drugs have a particular impact on your teeth that I could get into, but I mean, that'll give you your difference, right? Your benchmark difference. The other thing I wanted to mention about rent control, I mean, absolutely, if you want to decommodify housing, you have to put rent control in place. But I would add in that there are two, to your point about the financialization of the housing market, there's two significant threats to housing in all the cities that you talked about, Jim, along the coast and the strong economies. And one is Airbnb, which turns, I mean, now as a renter, you're competing against a hotel. And that's not like you have an extra room in your house or you're going away for the weekend, but a suite that is kept as permanent hotel stock that was intended as rental stock. We built 12,000 new rental housing units in Vancouver in about 6 years, and then figured out that we also had 12,000 new Airbnb units. They weren't the same because one was purpose-built, but all these suites and houses were being converted, and that was why we weren't seeing any change in the rental rates. And then the second, which is much worse, is the empty homes, this idea that you buy a house as a commodity that you just hold on to and watch it go up. And any city that's not taxing empty homes is going to have a housing and homelessness problem. It's not to say it will fix it, but it will definitely. We put ours in a year ago, and we saw somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 homes suddenly not empty and available in the rental market, which made a big difference on the cost of rents. So we have a couple minutes left, which is not going to be enough to do questions on this side of the room, but we're going to do one last question to the panel. If you have questions, there is like a 10-minute break before lunch, so I think you guys will be fine to hang out and people have one-on-one questions, yeah. So the last question I wanted to ask the panel was, this is a challenge, now that I've met you all, was one word, if you could leave the room. You can have a hyphen or two in it, but if you had to leave the room, I guess it's more with one concept. I brought this back up, this slide, because my one concept is this last one around registered voters, lowest rate of registered voters in the developed world. The UN rapporteur definitely points to that as cause number one, in his opinion, of what's driving poverty. So that would be thought I'd like to leave you all with, if you're not yet registered or you know people that aren't, and statistically that would be likely. Any thoughts? One slogan, Pete. You had some great ones. Okay.
One word.
Okay, how about one sentence?
I would just say involvement. I would say jump in.
Organize. Get anybody within your community, join an organization, and what you're passionate about and changing your neighborhood. Organize.
Yeah, it's hard. I'm having a hard time coming up with the word, but I would say it's something along the word of, we should be in this for the long haul. That there's no quick solution. So this is a long arc.
Okay, cool. So I want to thank the panelists. Organizers, all of you, if you are students or have been students, you can understand how much work it is to put on something like this. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you to all of you. I'm sure I speak for all of us, and you probably heard it in the comments we made, how awesome it is to see an army amassing to fight on this issue, because that is what's going to make the difference